let me get on to one more thing here now. All right, so now, as I've said many, many times, I 100% believe that the COVID virus is a thing, right? I'm certain of that. I think we know it. I'm not one of these people that says it's a hoax or anything like that, right? It is. It is obviously a problem. It is very serious. However, I do think that there is a great deal of hysteria, media hysteria. And of that, we have to be very, very careful. So I'm going to go through a brief history of some media predictions. So kicking us off, and I'm only going back a little over 50 years because, to be honest, I mean, it would take me weeks if I wanted to put everything in and go back to the beginning. But I mean, things have really kicked off in the last 50 years. And we go back to the 60s. A gentleman by the name of Paul Ehrlich, who of course was an expert. We always got to be wary of experts, right? Because they may be experts, but they're very often wrong, right? Or else they're self-serving or they got other motives. But Ehrlich, in the 1960s, he came up with a book called The Population Bomb. The Population Bomb. This was a bomb that was going to go off. And if you know anything about the world at that time, the 1960s, Europe and North America were in the midst of a baby boom that had started right after World War II and had gone right up to about 1970-ish. So there was a baby boom at the time, and Ehrlich looked at this and he predicted that there was going to be a population bomb which would lead to a famine. We would see widespread starvation completely around the world. And I kind of have coined my own term on this. I call it the goldfish mentality. And so a goldfish has about a 3-second memory. So essentially whatever a goldfish is doing, as far as it knows, it's been doing that its whole life, right? Because if your memory is only 3 seconds and it runs out every 3 seconds, when you're doing something, as soon as you've been doing something for 3 seconds, you assume that you've always been doing that, right? More or less. And that's what you see with things like this. I mean, people are in the midst of something and they extrapolate that completely beyond anything reasonable. So this was the prediction in the 60s. The population bomb, mass starvation was coming for us. So the media picked that up, but they started to get confused. So population overcrowding, it was sort of, by 2013, by this point, China's one-child policy had become a crisis. So even in the country with 1.3 billion, second most populous country in the world, they decided that one child was a crisis there. And in America, they were advertising the child-free life. So kind of a mixed message. In China, not enough kids was beginning to be a problem in a country with over 1 billion people. And in North America, the child-free life was the way to go, right? This followed from massive population fear and starvation, right? So we move to 2020. Well, declining population is now a disaster to be avoided at all costs. Europe needs more babies, many more babies, to avert a population disaster. Immigration has helped America retain population size amid rapidly declining fertility rate. Canada needs a lot more people, and soon. Our aging population will bring big problems within a decade if we don't increase immigration. Our target should be 100 million people by the next century. Empty planet, the shock of global population decline. So here you see, we've run the full gamut. We've run, guys, our population is out of control. You should be very scared, to, here it's bad, here it's good, to, we need more people, our population is falling. So, okay, guys, are you sure you're experts? Are you sure we should listen to you? So let's move on from that. Population was a big problem, then not a problem, then kind of a problem. I don't know. Okay, 1970s. Media circulates fear of global famine. Look, guys, you better take this seriously. Famine, 1975. Good old William and Paul Paddock. I guess they're brothers. Or else they're an early gay marriage. although that wasn't legal at the time. So maybe what were you guys up to? America's decision. Who will survive? Who's going to die? Get some fear into people, right? Are you going to die? Are you going to starve to death? Your kid's going to starve to death by 1975? Dire famine forecast by 1975. Los Angeles. It is already too late for the world to avoid a long period of famine. You see, it's already too late. Already baked into the cake, to use a food analogy for something to do with famine. Paul Ehrlich said, in the time of famines is upon us and will be at its worst and most disastrous by 1975. Well, if it's at its worst and most disastrous by 1975, wouldn't it just get worse after that? Like, would it suddenly just get better, or would just so many people die that the 10 people on the planet left would have way too much food? He said the population of the United States is already too big. This is at a time when it was about more than 100 million less than it is now. Birth control may have to be accomplished by making it involuntary and by putting sterilizing agents into staple foods and drinking water. So, I mean, if this was the common thought at the time, sterilizing agents into drinking water and food, are you fucking serious? Is this guy a nut? Anyways, this is the school of thought that's being pushed by everybody at that time. Going into along with routine measurements of population control. Okay, Palo Alto, California. Here's a different guy, and that was from the Salt Lake Tribune. So these are major newspapers, right? These are major books, major newspapers from the New York Times. The trouble with almost all environmental problems, says Paul Ehrlich, the population bio, is that by the time we have enough evidence to convince people, you're dead. All right, so there you go. Pretty scary stuff, right? Very, very scary stuff. This was what we were looking at going into the 1970s, late 60s. So where are we at today? Well, let's take a look at the historical reality. So you can see this is the year along here, and this is the population. So, and these are famines, global famines, right? So you can see population of 1 billion back in 1910 on the Earth. We had a famine then, had another one in the 1920s when the population had started to move up. But since 1960, it's been falling. And the number of famines in 2010 is virtually non-existent in any kind of significant scale, as the population has gone up and over 7 billion. Okay, so that is the historical trend. So clearly he was not on point, but obesity now kills more people worldwide than car crashes, terror attacks, and Alzheimer's. I don't know why they put Alzheimer's in there. That seems like a weird addition, but obesity now kills more people worldwide than certainly starvation, car crashes, terror attacks, and Alzheimer's. 5 takeaways from a giant study on an epidemic. Here we go with another epidemic. I don't know why this hasn't come as a pandemic, simply an epidemic. So not only was the media wrong, but they were wrong in the complete opposite direction. Like, he put out a book and the media ran with all of this stuff, and they could not have been more wrong. They couldn't have gone more in the wrong direction, right? So yeah, instead of starvation, now we're dealing with obesity as an epidemic. Let's move on. The New Ice Age, 1971. Time Magazine, The Big Freeze. This is by Victor Cohn from another prestigious newspaper, The Washington Post. The world could be as little as 50 or 60 years away from a disastrous new ice age, leading atmospheric scientist predicts. Leading atmospheric scientist. Sounds like an expert, right? If you're a leading atmospheric scientist, you sound like an expert. So, and the media has run with it. Time Magazine ran with it. Dr. S.I. Rasool of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration and Columbia University, good credentials, got to get those credentials, right? Says in the next 50 years, the fine dust man constantly puts into the atmosphere by fossil fuel burning could screen out so much sunlight that the average temperature could drop by 6 degrees. If sustained over several years, 5 to 10, he estimated. Such temperatures decrease could be sufficient to trigger an ice age. All right, well, we know 50 years just about has passed, and we know we're not in an ice age. So, but by the 90s, that ice age prediction had changed. The 90s, we were looking at warming. New York City's West Side Highway will be underwater by 2019. That hasn't happened. Children won't know what snow is by the year 2000. Well, children do know what snow is, right?
Yeah.
Yep. So Jim Hansen, the scientist who in 1988 predicted the greenhouse effect before Congress, went over to the window with him and looked out on Broadway in New York City. You got to have those theatrics. You got to have that presentation. You got to go look to the window. You got to sigh as you do it. And then you got to say, if what you're saying about the greenhouse effect is true, is anything going to look different down there in 20 years? He looked for a while and was quiet and didn't say anything for a couple seconds. Dramatic pause. And then he said, well, there will be more traffic. I don't think he heard the question right. Oh, and he explained, the West Side Highway, which runs along the Hudson River, will be underwater. Well, as you know, we regularly talk to somebody from New York, and I can assure you the West Side Highway is not underwater. And from another article in the year 2000, snowfalls are just going to be a thing of the past. A little ironic that we just had snow here in April on April 1st. And and for 3 days, the second and third as well, I think. So yeah, not so good, guys. Oh, and by the way, famine in 10 years. Yeah, you got that one wrong too. Boy, they're really persistent with this famine, right? If obesity is a global epidemic, maybe a famine wouldn't be such a bad thing. Maybe all these fatties can go a few days without eating. All right, let's move on. Let's move on to the next hype. Okay, climate change. So yeah, we went from ice age coming to, well, I think it's warming. Things are getting too hot. Snow is going to be a thing of the past. The highway is going to be underwater by 2019. So they're kind of frustrated now. And you know what? Listen, before I go any further, don't put me in this climate denier category. I am all for a clean environment, okay? I want clean water. I want clean air. I think there's been a lot of good measures put in place when it comes to pollution and all of these things, okay? Let me say that right from the get-go. Actually, I guess this wouldn't be the get-go. This would be midway, but let me be very clear about that, okay? I'm all for clean air and water, all for protecting the environment, okay? Climate change or global warming, 3 reasons not to be distracted by the name game. Okay, so first of all, we had the deep freeze, then we have the big warming, and now they're saying, look, man, forget about what the name is, okay? We're just gonna go with climate change. The climate's changing, guys. It's a problem. All right, I guess. I mean, isn't the climate always gonna change? Yeah. Okay, let's move on. So 1980s. Now, as a child of the 1980s, and I know many of my viewers also were young people in the 1980s, do you guys recall what we had to live with? We always had to live with the threat of nuclear war, which kind of sucks when you're a kid, right? When you're a teenager and you want to think of things like, you know, riding your bike, going to the arcade, stuff like that, kind of hangs over your head that, oh, next morning, despite anything you do, the whole world may go up in smoke. Oh, and you're not just going to get incinerated. If you do live, then you're going to be covered in radiation and dust, and you're going to starve, and you're going to get chemo, or you're going to just get radiation poisoning. It's going to be a long, gruesome death. Ugh, ugh. Okay, we get it, man. So in the 1980s, we had a proliferation. The famine clearly wasn't happening. You know, we weren't starving to death. We weren't entering the ice age. And so they're thinking, fuck, people just aren't scared enough, man. Let's find something else. Hey, remember that Cuban Missile Crisis we had with the Soviet Union back in the 60s? That got everyone's attention. Let's do something like that again. Great. What do? Nuclear war. We're just steps away from nuclear war. All right, so a bunch of films came out. The Late Great Planet Earth. Hey, by 1983, Nostradamus, of all people, prophesied that the world was going to be obliterated in a nuclear war. Okay. Red Dawn came out. This was a Soviet invasion, a Soviet and Cuban invasion of the United States, and a band of freedom fighters went out and lived in the wilderness and fought against them. Oops. War Games was another one. And the day after told us about what it would be like to live in following a nuclear war. And it was pretty depressing. So, but that was in the 80s. Less than 10 years later, Gorbachev's empire falls apart. The Soviet Union had disbanded, and they were our friends now. Time, starting over. Gorbachev turns his back on Lenin. Yanks to the rescue. The secret story of how American advisors helped Yeltsin win. Okay, so the bad guys that wanted to wipe us off the planet, hey, they're now our buddies. Scare over, right? Maybe not. 2007, Putin was Person of the Year. Wow. Oh, 2013, not so much. Threatening U.S., Putin promises Russians both missiles and butter. Now he's a bad guy. 2017, Xi from China, citizen of the world. Hey, good old guy Xi. 2019, not so much. China wants to dominate the world. Boy, they sure changed their minds quick, don't they? 1990s, starvation out, Soviet Union friend, let's do Y2K. So the 1990s were a tough time for doomsayers and things like that, because it was a pretty good decade. It was a pretty good decade. The Soviet Union had ended. The wall came down in Eastern Europe and Berlin as well. And we were all getting along, right? We were getting along. The internet age had started, but it hadn't really taken over people's lives. Things were pretty good. The economies were good everywhere. So they thought, damn it, there's not enough bad shit going on. Let's find something. So 1990s, the starvation is out. The Soviet Union was our friend. So let's do Y2K. And Y2K, if anybody remembers, some of the scare tactics we would get would be that planes would fall out of the sky. Fortunes would be wiped out overnight, all because computer systems were set up that they would the dates would roll over to zero. Instead of going from 1999, instead of going 1999, they would go all the way to zero, and nothing would work, right? So I'm going to tell you guys, I wasn't so scared. I rode the whole thing out. I went down to Mexico. I celebrated New Year's in Mexico. I ain't worried, guys. I had learned my lesson from the Soviet scare of the 1980s. But in all, preparation for Y2K cost the U.S. upwards of $100 billion. The Washington Post reported in November 1999, and that's November, so it probably would have gone up even from then. And this was all just people, preparing unnecessarily, building things they didn't need to build, buying shit they didn't need to buy. Although I don't remember anybody hoarding toilet paper back then. That seems to be a new phenomenon. Maybe people just take more dumps now. I don't know. Anyways, and this 2019, the media hyped Blake Shelton as the sexiest man alive. Now, come on. I mean, this is the worst case of overhype I have ever seen. They're saying he is the sexiest man alive, but in 2020, we see the reality. It's Rick Richards, right? All right. A little fun note to end for you guys. So, what is the point of all this, right? Well, like I said, okay, I mean, I certainly recognize that the coronavirus is real, right? And it is a problem, but we have to be careful of avoiding hysterical overreactions. And here's something interesting I found. This is from the good people at Wikipedia, or the assholes at Wikipedia, depending on what you think of them. List of mass hysteria cases. And there's been quite a few going right back to the Middle Ages. So, I mean, it's obviously human nature. It goes on and it goes on and it goes on and it goes on. And I stumbled upon this. Mass hysteria occurred during the 2019-2020 coronavirus pandemic. People predicted millions of deaths and closed global economies, killing many businesses and jobs and causing mass anxiety, to later realize that the death toll would not be worse than the 2009 swine flu pandemic, which claimed 150 to 570,000 lives worldwide. So, I mean, this is kind of like stepping into the future and looking back at this, right? I mean, we're still in this right now, right? But already some people have decided that, yeah, it's mass hysteria. And I would say I kind of agree with that. Again, I know it's a problem, but hey, we don't need to shut down the global economy, okay? We don't need to bundle ourselves up every time we leave the house. We don't need the police watching us when we walk through a park. We don't need beaches closed. You know, a lot of the stuff we really don't need and we really shouldn't have. So anyways, keep that in mind when you see these nasty predictions from the media, right? Keep it in mind whenever you hear from an expert. Do not just believe experts, okay? A lot of times experts are motivated by something else. They're motivated to sell whatever they're producing, or they are motivated to get attention. If an expert came on to you and said, well, I really don't see a lot of problems in the near future. I think everything's pretty much under control. That would be the last you'd see of them, right? You need them to come on and go, we've got a big problem and this is why you need to be scared. That's what they do. That's how they continue their relevance, right? So anyways, keep all that stuff in mind. Remember, stick together, and if we stand together, can't nobody stand against us. I am out.